The wind howled through the streets of Chicago, biting into the skin of anyone unfortunate enough to be outside. Among the few souls braving the cold was Thomas, a homeless man in his late 40s. His tattered coat barely shielded him from freezing temperatures as he shuffled down the sidewalk, searching for a warm spot to sleep. Life had been unkind to Thomas, but he still held on to a glimmer of hope. As he turned a corner, he noticed a tall man struggling with a flat tire on a sleek, black car. The man was dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, his face partially hidden by a cap. Without hesitation, Thomas approached. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice rough but kind. The stranger looked up, surprised, and nodded. Together, they worked to change the tire, with Thomas offering guidance despite his own hardships. Little did Thomas know, the man he was helping was none other than Michael Jordan, the basketball legend. Once the tire was fixed, Michael Jordan extended his hand to Thomas. "Thank you," he said sincerely, his voice warm and genuine. Thomas shook his hand, noticing the firm grip and the kindness in the stranger's eyes. "No problem," Thomas replied with a small smile. "We all need help sometimes." Michael reached into his wallet and pulled out a few bills, handing them to Thomas. "Take this," he said. Thomas hesitated, but Michael insisted. "You've done more for me tonight than most people would. This is the least I can do." Thomas accepted the money, his heart swelling with gratitude. As Michael drove away, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about the man, but he couldn't quite place it. Thomas sat on a nearby bench, clutching the money Michael had given him. It was enough to buy a warm meal and maybe even a night in a cheap motel. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of relief. As he sat there, he replayed the encounter in his mind. The man's height, his demeanor, and the way he carried himself, it all seemed so familiar. The next morning, Thomas decided to use some of the money to buy a newspaper. As he flipped through the pages, his eyes landed on a photo of Michael Jordan. His heart skipped a beat. It was him, the man he had helped last night. Thomas couldn't believe it. He had just assisted one of the most famous athletes in the world, without even realizing it. A mix of shock and pride washed over him as he stared at the photo. News of Thomas's good deed spread quickly after Michael Jordan mentioned the encounter in an interview. "There are good people everywhere," Michael had said, "even in the most unexpected places." His words resonated with millions, and soon Thomas became a symbol of kindness and humility. Strangers began approaching Thomas on the streets, offering him food, clothes, and even job opportunities. While he was grateful, Thomas remained humble, often redirecting the help to others in need. "I didn't do anything special," he would say. "I just helped someone who needed it." His selflessness only deepened the admiration people felt for him. One evening, as Thomas was settling into his usual spot under a bridge, a black car pulled up. The window rolled down and Michael Jordan's face appeared. "Hey, Thomas," Michael said with a smile. "I've been looking for you." Thomas was stunned. "Mr. Jordan," he stammered, "what are you doing here?" Michael stepped out of the car and handed Thomas a bag. Inside were warm clothes, shoes, and a note. "You helped me when I needed it," Michael said. "Now let me help you." The note contained an address and a time. "Be here tomorrow," Michael said. "I have something for you." Thomas nodded, his heart racing with anticipation. The next day, Thomas arrived at the address Michael had given him. It was a community center, bustling with activity. Michael greeted him at the door and led him inside. "This is where we help people get back on their feet," Michael explained, "and I want you to be part of it." Thomas was offered a job at the center, helping others who were struggling like he once had. Overwhelmed with emotion, he accepted. For the first time in years, Thomas felt a sense of purpose. Michael's kindness had not only changed Thomas's life, but also inspired him to pay it forward. That's stepped into the community center, his eyes wide with wonder. The place was filled with people, volunteers serving meals, children playing games, and adults attending workshops. Michael Jordan walked beside him, introducing him to the staff. "This is Thomas," Michael said. "He's going to be joining us here." The staff greeted Thomas warmly, making him feel instantly at home. As Michael showed him around, Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of belonging. "This place is amazing," Thomas said. I can't believe you're doing all this. Michael smiled. It's not just me, he replied. It's everyone here. And now it's you too. Thomas felt a surge of gratitude and determination. He was ready to make a difference. Thomas's first day at the community center was a whirlwind of activity. He was assigned to help in the kitchen, preparing meals for those in need. As he chopped vegetables and stirred pots, he struck up conversations with the other volunteers. Many of them had stories similar to his, struggles with homelessness, addiction, or loss. Thomas realized he wasn't alone. By the end of the day, Thomas was exhausted but fulfilled. He had served over 100 meals and made a few new friends. As he left the center, Michael approached him. "How was your first day?" he asked. Thomas smiled. "It was great," he said. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Michael patted him on the back. "You earned it," he said. "Keep up the good work." Over the next few weeks, Thomas and Michael grew closer. They often spent their lunch breaks together, sharing stories and laughter. Thomas learned about Michael's journey, his struggles, his triumphs, and his desire to give back. Michael, in turn, listened to Thomas's story with empathy and respect. One day, Michael asked Thomas, "What's your dream? If you could do anything, what would it be?" Thomas thought for a moment. "I've always wanted to help people," he said. "Maybe open my own shelter someday." Michael nodded. "That's a great dream," he said, "and I'll help you make it happen." A month after Thomas started working at the community center, Michael called a staff meeting. Everyone gathered in the main hall. Curious about the announcement, Michael stood at the front, a smile on his face. "I have some exciting news," he said. "Thanks to your hard work and dedication, we're expanding. We're opening a new shelter downtown." The room erupted in applause. Thomas felt a surge of pride. He had been part of something incredible. After the meeting, Michael pulled him aside. "I want you to help lead the new shelter," he said. Thomas was speechless. "Me?" he asked. Michael nodded. "You've got what it takes," he said. "I believe in you." The next few weeks were a blur of planning and preparation. Thomas worked closely with Michael and the team to get the new shelter ready. They painted walls, arranged furniture, and stocked the pantry. Thomas felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. On the day of the grand opening, Thomas stood beside Michael as they cut the ribbon. The shelter was beautiful, a safe, welcoming space for those in need. As they toured the facility, Thomas couldn't help but feel proud. "This is just the beginning," Michael said. "Together, we're going to change lives." The new shelter quickly became a haven for the homeless community. Thomas worked tirelessly, helping residents find jobs, access health care, and rebuild their lives. His own experiences made him uniquely qualified to understand their struggles. One day, a young man named Alex arrived at the shelter. He was shy and withdrawn, much like Thomas had been when he first met Michael. Thomas took Alex under his wing, offering guidance and support. As he watched Alex grow more confident, Thomas realized how far he had come. He was no longer just a recipient of kindness. He was a giver. The shelter's success inspired others to get involved. Local businesses donated supplies, volunteers offered their time, and the community rallied together. Thomas became a well-known figure, admired for his dedication and compassion. Michael often visited the shelter, checking in on Thomas and the residents. "You've done an amazing job," Michael told him one day. "I'm proud of you." Thomas smiled. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. Michael shook his head. "This was all you," he said. "I just gave you a push." A year after the shelter opened, Thomas achieved his dream. With Michael's support, he opened his own shelter in a neighboring town. The opening ceremony was attended by hundreds, including Michael, who gave a heartfelt speech. "Thomas is proof that one act of kindness can change the world," he said. As Thomas stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had come a long way from that cold night in Chicago, and he knew his journey was just beginning. Thomas's new shelter, named Hope Haven, quickly became a beacon of light in the community. It was larger than the first shelter, with more resources and space to accommodate those in need. Thomas poured his heart into every detail, ensuring it felt like a home rather than just a building. He wanted everyone who walked through the doors to feel valued and supported. On the first night, Thomas stood in the dining hall, watching as volunteers served warm meals to the residents. He felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude. Michael Jordan, who had flown in for the opening, stood beside him. "You've built something incredible," Michael said. Thomas smiled. "It's not just me," he replied. "It's everyone who believed in this dream." One of the first residents at Hope Haven was a woman named Maria. She had been living on the streets for years, struggling with addiction and loss. Thomas recognized the pain in her eyes. It was the same pain he had once carried. He sat with her, listening to her story and offering words of encouragement. Over time, Maria began to heal. She attended counseling sessions, joined job training programs, and even started volunteering at the shelter. Thomas watched her transformation with pride. "You're doing amazing," he told her one day. Maria smiled. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. Thomas shook his head. "You did this," he said. "I just gave you a safe place to start." As Hope Haven flourished, Thomas's story continued to inspire others. News outlets picked up his journey, and he was invited to speak at events and conferences. Thomas used these opportunities to advocate for the homeless and to encourage others to lend a helping hand. Michael Jordan often joined him at these events, sharing how Thomas's kindness had impacted him. "Thomas reminded me that we all have the power to make a difference," Michael said during one speech. "It's not about how much you have, it's about what you do with it." The audience erupted in applause, and Thomas felt a surge of gratitude for the man who had changed his life. Inspired by the success of the book, Thomas and Michael launched a new initiative, Hope Stories. The project aimed to collect and share stories of resilience and kindness from people around the world. They created a website and social media platforms where people could submit their stories. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of stories poured in, each one a testament to the power of hope and human connection. Thomas and Michael spent hours reading the submissions, often moved to tears by the courage and compassion they encountered. Hope Stories quickly became a global movement. People from all walks of life shared their experiences, creating a tapestry of hope and resilience. The project garnered media attention, and Thomas and Michael were invited to speak at international events. One evening, as they stood on a stage in London, Thomas addressed the crowd. "These stories remind us that we are not alone," he said. "No matter where we come from or what we've been through, we all have the power to make a difference." The audience erupted in applause, and Thomas felt a deep sense of fulfillment. As the years went by, Thomas often reflected on his journey. He thought about the cold night in Chicago, the kindness of Michael Jordan, and the countless lives he had touched since then. He realized that his story was not just about overcoming adversity. It was about the power of human connection. One evening, as he sat in his apartment, Thomas wrote in his journal, "Kindness is a ripple. One small act can create waves that touch countless lives. I am proof of that, and so are all the people who have shared their stories with me." Thomas began mentoring young leaders who were passionate about making a difference. He taught them the importance of empathy, resilience, and community. One of his mentors, a young woman named Emma, reminded him of Maria, the first resident at Hope Haven. Emma had experienced homelessness as a child and was determined to help others in similar situations. Thomas guided her as she launched her own nonprofit, providing support and encouragement every step of the way. Watching Emma grow into a leader filled Thomas with pride. As Emma's nonprofit began to grow, Thomas felt a renewed sense of purpose. He saw in her the same determination and compassion that had driven him all these years. Together, they worked on expanding the reach of Hope Stories, creating a platform where people from all walks of life could share their experiences of overcoming adversity. The initiative gained traction globally, with stories pouring in from every corner of the world. One day, Thomas received a letter from a young girl in India named Priya. She wrote about how her family had been struggling after losing their home, but a local shelter inspired by Hope Haven had given them a second chance. Priya's dream was to become a doctor and help others in need. Thomas was deeply moved by her story and decided to visit India to meet her. When Thomas arrived in India, he was greeted by a crowd of people who had been inspired by his work. Priya stood at the front, holding a bouquet of flowers. "Thank you for coming," she said, her eyes shining with gratitude. Thomas smiled and knelt down to her level. "No, thank you," he said. "Your story inspired me to keep going. You're proof that hope can change lives." During his visit, Thomas toured the shelter that had helped Priya's family. He was amazed by the dedication of the staff and the resilience of the residents. Before leaving, Thomas promised to support Priya's education and help her achieve her dream of becoming a doctor. It was a moment that reminded him why he had started this journey in the first place. Back in Chicago, Thomas shared Priya's story with Michael. "This is what it's all about," Thomas said. "One act of kindness can create a ripple effect that changes the world." Michael nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "You've built something incredible, Thomas," he said, "and it's only going to grow from here." Inspired by Priya's story, Thomas and Michael launched a new initiative called Hope Scholars. The program aimed to provide scholarships and mentorship to young people from underserved communities, helping them achieve their dreams. Priya became the first recipient of the scholarship, and her story inspired countless others to apply. The documentary's release sparked a new wave of support for Thomas's initiatives. Donations poured in, and volunteers from around the world reached out to get involved. Thomas was overwhelmed by the response, but remained grounded, always redirecting the focus to the people he served. One evening, as Thomas was preparing for a screening of The Ripple Effect in Chicago, he received a surprise visit from Michael. "I wouldn't miss this for the world," Michael said, clapping Thomas on the back. The two friends walked into the theater together, greeted by a crowd of supporters. As the film played, Thomas watched his journey unfold on the screen, feeling a mix of pride and humility. After the screening, Thomas took the stage to answer questions from the audience. A young boy raised his hand and asked, "What's the most important lesson you've learned?" Thomas smiled. "The most important lesson," he said, "is that no act of kindness is too small. Every gesture, no matter how simple, has the power to change someone's life. And when we come together, we can change the world." The audience erupted in applause, and Thomas felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had come a long way from that cold night in Chicago, but he knew his work was far from over. There were still countless people in need, and he was determined to keep fighting for them. In the months that followed, Thomas focused on expanding Hope Scholars to reach even more young people. He traveled to schools and universities, sharing his story and encouraging students to dream big. One of his stops was at a high school in Detroit, where he met a young man named Marcus. Marcus had grown up in a tough neighborhood, but he had big dreams of becoming an engineer. Thomas was struck by Marcus's determination and offered him a scholarship through Hope Scholars. "You have what it takes," Thomas told him, "and I'll be here to support you every step of the way." As Marcus began his studies, Thomas stayed in touch, offering guidance and encouragement. Watching Marcus thrive reminded Thomas of why he had started this journey in the first place. It wasn't just about providing resources. It was about believing in people and giving them the chance to succeed. Meanwhile, Hope's stories continued to grow, with new submissions pouring in every day. Thomas and his team curated the stories into a book titled Stories of Hope, which became a bestseller. The book featured tales of resilience, kindness, and triumph from people around the world, each one a testament to the power of the human spirit. One of the stories in the book was about a woman named Sophia who had escaped an abusive relationship and rebuilt her life with the help of a shelter inspired by Hope Haven. Sophia's story touched Thomas deeply, and he invited her to speak at a global conference on homelessness. When Sophia took the stage, her voice was steady but filled with emotion. "I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the kindness of strangers," she said. "Thomas's work gave me hope when I had none. And now, I'm here to tell you that no matter how dark things may seem, there is always a way forward." The audience rose to their feet, applauding Sophia's courage. Thomas felt a lump in his throat as he watched her. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had dedicated his life to this work. As the years passed, Thomas's legacy continued to grow. He was honored with numerous awards, but he always remained humble, redirecting the focus to the people he served. "This isn't about me," he would say. "It's about all of us coming together to make a difference." One evening, as Thomas sat at his apartment, he received a call from Michael. "I have an idea," Michael said. "Let's build a Hope City, a community designed to provide housing, education, and job training for those in need." Thomas's eyes lit up. "That's exactly what we need," he said. "Let's make it happen." Together, Thomas and Michael began planning Hope City, a groundbreaking project that would serve as a model for communities around the world. They partnered with architects, educators, and community leaders to design a space where people could rebuild their lives with dignity and hope. When Hope City opened its doors, it was a moment of triumph. The community featured affordable housing, schools, job training centers, and even a small park where families could gather. Thomas stood at the entrance, watching as the first residents moved in. "This is what hope looks like," he said to Michael, "and it's just the beginning." As the sun set on Hope City, Thomas felt a deep sense of peace. He had come a long way from that cold night in Chicago, but he knew his work was far from over. There were still countless people in need, and he was determined to keep fighting for them. One evening, as Thomas sat at his apartment, he opened his journal and began to write. "Kindness is a ripple," he wrote. "One small act can create waves that touch countless lives. I am proof of that, and so are all the people who have shared their stories with me. Together, we can change the world." As he closed his journal, Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had come a long way, but he knew his journey was far from over, and he was ready to keep going one act of kindness at a time. The audience erupted in applause, and Thomas felt a lump in his throat as he handed out diplomas. One of the graduates, a young woman named Amina, stepped forward to speak. "Thomas," she said, "you've shown us that no dream is too big and no act of kindness is too small. You've given us the tools to create change, and we promise to carry your legacy forward." As the ceremony ended, Thomas stood with Michael, watching the graduates celebrate with their families. "We've come a long way," Michael said, his voice filled with pride. Thomas nodded. "And the best part is, this is just the beginning. These young leaders will take what we've started and make it even greater." In the years that followed, Thomas gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations of his initiatives, entrusting them to the next generation of leaders. He spent his time mentoring, writing, and speaking, always reminding people of the power of hope and kindness. His story had become a global inspiration, taught in schools and shared in communities around the world. One evening, as Thomas sat in his apartment, he opened his journal and began to write. "Kindness is a ripple," he wrote. "One small act can create waves that touch countless lives. I am proof of that, and so are all the people who have shared their stories with me. Together, we can change the world." As he closed his journal, Thomas felt a deep sense of peace. He had come a long way from that cold night in Chicago, but he knew his work was far from over. There were still countless people in need, and he was determined to keep fighting for them. One day, as Thomas was preparing for a speech at the United Nations, he received a surprise visit from Priya. She had graduated from medical school and was now working as a doctor in a rural clinic in India. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "You gave me the chance to achieve my dream, and now I'm doing the same for others." Thomas felt a lump in his throat as he hugged Priya. "You made me so proud," he said, "and you're proof that hope can change the world." As Thomas stood on the stage at the United Nations, he looked out at the crowd of world leaders. "This journey started with a simple act of kindness," he said, "and it has grown into a movement that has touched countless lives. But it's not just my story. It's the story of everyone who has chosen to make a difference." The audience rose to their feet, applauding Thomas's words. As he stepped off the stage, Michael was waiting for him. "You've come a long way," Michael said, his voice filled with pride. Thomas smiled. "We've come a long way," he replied, "and we're just getting started." In the final years of his life, Thomas continued to inspire and mentor, always reminding people of the power of hope and kindness. When he passed away, the world mourned the loss of a true hero, but his legacy lived on in the countless lives he had touched. At his memorial service, Michael stood before a crowd of thousands and said, "Thomas showed us that no act of kindness is too small and no dream is too big. He taught us that together we can change the world. And though he may be gone, his legacy will live on in every life he touched and every heart he inspired." As the sun set on the day of Thomas's memorial, a young boy stood by the entrance of Hope City in Chicago. He looked up at the sign and whispered, "Thank you, Thomas. I'll make you proud." And so, the ripple of kindness continued, spreading across the world, one act of hope at a time.